Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I'm back taking another look at Naoki Urosawa's Monster, and we are into volume 2 of the Perfect Collection, and we are looking at the first 8 chapters in here. That's chapters 19 through 24. And this is a development now on Tenma's dilemma. Just like we saw at the end of the last book where he had learned to fire a gun. He had learned how to kill a person if he had to in preparation for his next confrontation with Johan. We see him moving forward now as a person of very questionable legal standing. He's wanted in connection to a number of murders, and he's trying to decide what he's going to do when he finds Johan. But we see him struggle with this question, not directly, not in an existential crisis, not in an internal monologue, but as he meets and deals with new people in the process of looking for Johan. There's 3 case studies in this story. The first is Otto Heckel, and this is a thief. He breaks into the house of somebody murdered by Johan, and he finds Tenma there looking for clues that will help him catch up to Johan. And Heckel is an interesting character. He sees Tenma as a resource he can try and take advantage of. While Heckel is a thief, of course, he is broadly involved with the criminal world. The way he is dressed suggests he's a member of some kind of organized crime. I'm not sure what exactly existed in Germany in this time period, but he looks like a member of the Yakuza, which is probably Urosawa trying to signal just general illegitimacy to his audience than anything in particular. Along the way, they run into this guy here. This is a person that Johan used to commit the murders. Well, he actually pulled the trigger on the gun. Johan incited him to it. And he did this using a very clever series of psychological manipulations and intimations. He never said anything directly. And we start to see this picture of Johan taking shape where he is a puppet master. When we were first introduced to him, Johan actually killed a person with his own hands. And I think this was to help drive home to the audience and to Tenma that he's a bad dude in and of himself. He's not just a puppet master and a manipulator. He does have that very cold-blooded murderous streak baked into him down to the bone. But manipulating people seems to be his primary modus operandi. And he says, this guy says, he joined the family of the Spanglers, the dead people, but eventually they went their own ways. And at that point, Johan revealed that Mr. Spangler had a mistress and incited this guy to deal with it. You know, it was a very ugly, disgusting thing. And Spangler tells him, well, you can just kill them and erase the past. But that's, of course, not the way it works. Eventually, Johan's victim here also kills himself, perhaps as a way to deal with his own sense of guilt, and leaves Tenma very, very shocked. But with a letter, with a clue where they eventually find a letter that Johan had written for Tenma behind his painting. And from this expression here, we can see that Tenma is very perturbed by this. I don't know if he's disgusted, but he's definitely angry because he realizes that Johan is enjoying leaving this trail of bodies for him to find. And this is the first place where we see Tenma really struggling with what is he going to do when he finds Johan. Clearly leaning towards violence in this story. But we immediately get Otto putting Tenma in a very different kind of situation. As I said, Otto immediately saw Tenma as someone he could exploit. He recognized him as a wanted criminal, but also, according to his write-up in the papers, a doctor. So he puts Tenma in touch with a terrorist group or a criminal group that's looking for a doctor, and they bring them to these people who are considered terrorists according to the news. One of them has been injured on the run from the law. Tenma confronts him. There's an argument, and Tenma says he's not going to help this person. He's not going to do any surgeries. He's not going to administer any first aid. And the injured man's associate threatens to kill him. As you can see, there's a lot of waving of guns in this situation. And essentially, Tenma winds up kind of being held a hostage. But he refuses because he doesn't think he's dealing with a person. He thinks he's dealing with a monster. He's worried that if he saves this man's life, he's just turned another Johan loose on the world. So he's willing to die rather than help this man. But eventually, as they argue back and forth, let's see, where is it? It comes to a moment where the terrorist, who has been proclaiming his ideals for a while now, his goals to do something for his country, and eventually he comes to a point where he says, "I'm proud of what I did. I'm proud." And then after a moment he says, "Cold. I'm cold." And his associate says, "Hang in there. Our friends will be here soon if you just hang on." And the injured man says, "No, they're not coming. I can feel it." And, Tenma is just sitting here silently, and the injured man's associate once again threatens him with a gun, tells him to stop the bleeding or he'll kill Tenma. And it's when the injured man says, "I don't want to die," that Tenma finally decides to get up and take a hand. And he says, "Are you scared to die? They were all scared to die, all 12 of the people you killed." And this time, injured man is silent. He doesn't protest his pride or his cause. He knows he's at the end of his rope. And that's when Tenma makes the decision that he will, in fact, do surgery, stitch up the wounds, and take the man to a hospital. And it's because at that moment, he explains later on, he got the sense that this man was human after all. He looked in his eyes. He saw the fear of death. It's a very different expression than what we've seen on Johan's face so far, where Johan has almost no feelings at all most of the time. He's kind of in a serene state of Zen, where he can do anything, and the effects of that action do not rebound on him in any way. It's really very frightening, more so than a kind of rage at the world, or a sense of despondent nihilism, or even, a sense of purpose, like you might see in a character like Thanos, where he's trying to undertake something great and good for the universe. Johan is so disconnected and so serene, it doesn't seem like anything he does or anything done to him will ever change him at all. That includes violence, because we know he's already come back from the dead once. Makes him a very, very intimidating figure, even though he's not physically intimidating or very directly intimidating. He's not loud and threatening either. But this man doesn't have that sense, and Tenma eventually comes to the decision that he can save this man's life and know that he hasn't unleashed another monster like that. It's an interesting moment, and it shows Tenma trying to develop a heuristic where he can decide whether he can safely save someone without unleashing another monster, which is something he is understandably very concerned about. From this point, Tenma goes looking for Johan again, and he begins to hear about orphanages in East Germany and about Kinderheim 511. Kinderheim is apparently, I believe, it translates to child home in German, and it seems to be the local term for orphanage. And he learns that Johan was at Kinderheim 511, and the only person he can really talk to about that is Herr Hartmann. So he goes and he talks with Hartmann here, this fellow. On the way, he runs into a kid in the street named Dieter. Dieter eventually turns out to be living with Herr Hartmann, and that's an important note. But before actually Tenma learns that Dieter is living with Herr Hartmann, he gets some of the background on Kinderheim 511, and he learns that it was a facility. It was largely run by the Department of the Interior as a top secret project. The German government sealed a lot of it up, and Hartmann says it was a mutiny. He gets about that far before he can explain anything else. Dieter comes home. He doesn't want to tell the story in front of a child, which Tenma understands. So he eats dinner with Hartmann and Dieter and then leaves, intending to come back later and get the details once there's no young people around to hear the disturbing story. But since Dieter wanted a soccer ball, he goes out and he buys one and he brings it back with him. And this shows Tenma's sense of care for the people around him and his desire to be benevolent, even as he's caught up in this bigger situation, which is a nice character touch for him. You know, it shows he is on the ball, so to speak, in dealing with these things. But when he comes back, he begins to piece together a very disturbing sense of what's going on, because it turns out that Hartmann has been abusing Dieter, and in fact, for interrupting his conversation with Tenma, Hartmann has beaten Dieter and broken his arm. Tenma threatens Hartmann with a gun and takes Dieter out of his custody, takes him to a hospital where he meets some people from Kinderheim 47, I believe it is, which is now an official orphanage, unlike Kinderheim 511, which is closed and pretty much a ruin now. This is under the new unified German government. Kinderheim 47 has become an official orphanage and is really run under better conditions. I don't remember if they ever say the name of the orphanage in here, but he meets the administrator of there, and she tells him, because she also served in Kinderheim 47 and heard the story about 511, she says it was probably some kind of research project to create good soldiers for the Soviet and communist government of East Germany, and they were trying to mentally condition the children to be good soldiers there. Unfortunately, there was the mutiny, which Hartmann mentioned, and the children and the staff fought each other to the death. Not clear how Hartmann survived, but some of the senior staff seems to have either not been present or just been reported dead, even though they survived. Hartmann is one of those people, and he's been trying to recreate what happened at Kinderheim 511 with Dieter, thus the abuse, manipulation, and that's also why Hartmann comes back and he takes Dieter out of the hospital when Tenma is not present, when he's talking to this administrator from the other orphanage. So when Tenma comes back to check in on Dieter, he's missing, and he chases Hartmann and Dieter to the ruins of Kinderheim 511, where he finds Dieter sitting in a chair at the top of the stairs with a fire to his right-hand side, and Herr Hartmann just behind him. We learned that Johan sat in this exact same spot when the massacre at Kinderheim 511 took place. He watched it all happen because Johan had incited this massacre. This is another indication, based on Hartmann's testimony, that Johan was always a demented creature. They didn't create him there. They didn't torture him into what he became. He manipulated people, even the staff, into killing each other because he had a natural talent for this kind of sadism and manipulation. And even though Hartmann has spent his whole life trying to recreate that magnificent monster, as he calls him, he's never succeeded. And in fact, he did not succeed with Dieter. And we see some of the very twisted nature that has taken root in Hartmann here, because he thinks he loves Dieter. He thinks he's preparing Dieter for a very dark future. Keeps telling him tomorrow is going to be black as night, and Dieter needs to understand the lessons that Hartmann is trying to teach. if he wants to survive. And Tenma says, I'm going to take Dieter away from you. And Hartman says, well, he doesn't want to leave. And so Tenma says to Dieter, it's your choice. You can make it. If you want to leave, come down to me. Hartman says, well, Dieter would never leave me. He's my little boy. But Dieter does leave him. And in that moment, we see Hartman completely break down because he thought he was doing something good by preparing Dieter for the terrible future he foresees. And in this, again, we see Tenma grappling with the question of whether he can save a person from this kind of abuse. And he saves Dieter. Clearly, he's very concerned with Dieter. Dieter travels with him for a while longer. But he's considering the question of whether he can save a person from the top of those stairs, from that kind of violence and abuse. If he couldn't have done it for Dieter, that probably would have been a sign to him that he couldn't do it for Johan either. But he does save Dieter. It doesn't mean he can save Johan as well. Johan is worse off. As Hartman said, he was a natural monster. He wasn't created as one. But it's a step in the right direction. So here's our second story about Tenma grappling with what Johan actually is and asking himself the question, can I be a doctor and save someone here, or do I have to rely on violence? Ironically, in all of this, he does have to at least threaten violence. We see him brandish his gun quite a bit. Clearly, Tenma is not afraid of dangerous things. He's always been performing surgeries and using scalpels, and perhaps in his hands, the gun can be another scalpel, but we're not sure yet. The final story involves him meeting another doctor. This is a country doctor in Germany, and this country doctor kind of lives, I think, what Tenma starts to think of as an ideal life. He goes around small communities. He helps people stay healthy. He has a little bit of baggage of his own, which they have to sort out. There's really not a whole lot of interesting character revelations here. As such, it's very well executed, and as a way to show a person in a very deadly place a taste of normal life, I think it does very well. Because Tenma does really enjoy just being a normal doctor for a while. And he helps the local doctor save a life. He does some surgery. And he clearly finds this very fulfilling. It's something he wants. But he can't stay because Johan is still out there. And when they part, the local doctor says, you could save many lives in this village if you stay. We could work together. Tenma says, as he walks off, saving lives. There's a man I have to kill. And those are his parting words to this doctor. And we see in this story that the simple calling of being a doctor still has incredible power for Tenma. Something he really wants. But the calling to deal with Johan is stronger than that. And he, at least at this point in the story, is still focused on violence as the way to answer that. So this final story shows us that Tenma is grappling with his contradictory callings, and right now, the calling to Johan is winning. And he's not the only person that feels this kind of inevitable calling. The last chapter in here is very interesting. It's called The Man Left Behind, and it focuses on Inspector Lunge of the, I guess he's Interpol at this point. And we follow the inspector on a case, basically, as he tries to crack it. Ava Heidelman, which is Tenma's ex-fiancée from the first volume, is pestering him about the Tenma case, but right now, Lunge is trying to work out the murder of someone related to a publishing house owner. He pressures the publishing house secretary and eventually gets her to give him evidence he thinks he can use to extract a confession from the publishing house owner. But he pushes his case really hard. And that's really the purpose of this chapter. Tenma is pushing himself very hard in his pursuit of Johan. It's taking him away from his calling. It's made him a criminal. It's put him on the run. He's very stressed all of the time. And of course, he's trying to decide whether he can put aside his ethics as a doctor long enough to kill Johan. All of these things are incredible pressures on his life that come from his drive to catch Johan. And Lunge is the drive to find and catch an evil writ large, because that's all he does in his life. And we see in this chapter, we see that has warped Lunge to the point where he is no longer a person. He is on the borderline to becoming a monster himself. Really very worrying to see that kind of implacable, undetermined thing potentially chasing Tenma. And in this case, he puts too much pressure on the secretary. He extracts false information from her, and then she feels so guilty for lying so that the police will leave her alone that she commits suicide. And in her suicide note, she confesses that she lied to Lunge and that the owner of the publishing house is innocent, or at least not guilty of the things she accused him of. Lunge's superiors take him off the case, take him off all his cases, and they leave him with nothing to do. At the same time, his family, who Lunge has not really been talking to, who he has been ignoring in just about every panel we see them together in, his family leaves him. His wife leaves him for a lover. His daughter leaves him because she's gotten pregnant with a man and she's moving in with the father of her unborn child. And Lunge, the great detective, never figured either of these out. So clearly, not only has his drive to deal with the cases on his desk completely warped his professional standard, it's also destroyed him personally. And at the end of this chapter, we see Lunge sitting at his desk. His phone is not ringing. He's not busy. There are no case files there. He opens a drawer, and he pulls out a picture of Tenma and says, well, that's all I have left. Then one of the other Interpol officers out on the floor pokes his head into Lunge's office and says, Inspector, you have a visitor. It's that Eva Heinemann woman again. And Lunge, who has ignored her up until this point, says, well, send her in. I haven't seen any signs that Lunge has changed, had some kind of growth or revelation about himself. No, the implacable Lunge is simply turned his sights to Tenma, and that's not a good thing for our hero. No, sir. Especially not when you mix it with a spiteful woman like Eva Heinemann, but that's a story for later. I like this development because it shows that Tenma, while each of the small stories that he goes through in the greater arc of Monster is about him trying to understand Johan and how he's going to deal with Johan, there is a lot of time and energy devoted to unpacking and understanding Tenma in situations that have nothing to do with Johan or very little to do with him. And that makes for fascinating reading. This is not just The Fugitive in Germany, though. This is about a question of what makes Johan tick and what makes Tenma tick. We see what makes Johan tick when he goes and he says to people like Hartman, I want to be the last man standing at the end of the world. And we see what makes Tenma tick when he tries to decide how he heals a person and how he makes them whole, particularly when dealing with a terrorist, not just in deciding when he would treat them, but in speaking to him in a way that made him see that while he could be proud of his country and his cause, he shouldn't be proud of the actions he took in defense of it, because there was evil in them, as well as a worthy cause. And it's this distinction between the two, the very careful and measured and doubtful approach of Tenma, as compared to the very immature, very self-satisfied, and certain approach of Johan. That's a really great contrast to see. It's also interesting to see characters like Lunge, who are kind of like Johan in that they hold themselves completely aloof. And even if you pay close attention to the expressions on Lunge's face at various moments, almost detached with that same level of bliss, where it doesn't matter what happens to him, none of it actually affects him in his pursuit of his goals. Lunge is frightening in the same way Johan is frightening, because all his connections to the world around him are severed, and yet he doesn't seem bothered. It's a great bit of writing that manages to accomplish an incredible amount in a short number of pages, primarily by showing us things rather than telling us things. I really, really become more impressed with it every time I read it. And it's interesting doing this right after rereading 20th Century Boys, because to a certain extent, at least in the early parts of that story, I became more enamored of it as I was reading it, just like I did with Monster. But a lot of the shine of the story in the middle didn't go away, but it became a little bit duller. And I'm interested to see whether I will continue to find this as good as I do now, or whether, like that other story, Urosawa will fall off a little bit at the end. I don't think so. I have reread this more recently. I had reread 20th Century Boys, and I remember the middle and the ending being pretty strong as well, although he does get a little lost in the weeds at the very end, maybe. I'll make my argument for and against that when we get to the later volumes, though. As it is right now, though, some great character work in here, and a great slow boil unpacking of our villain, not only through his own actions, but in comparison to other characters like Lunge, and when we are reintroduced to her in the next chapter, Ava. But that's all I got for you today. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.